Right now, as you watch this, Canada is on fire from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific. Roughly 1,000 active wildfires are burning across the country. More than 3 million hectares have already gone up this season. Whole towns have been ordered to flee, and the smoke pouring south has pushed the air quality in American cities to some of the worst readings ever recorded. One Midwestern city saw its air quality index spike past 600 into a range that is simply labeled hazardous. And here is the truly staggering part. This, a continent-spanning wildfire emergency in one of the largest countries on Earth, has become almost routine. This is the fourth severe fire season in Canada in a row. And just 3 years ago, in 2023, the country burned on a scale that has, quite literally, no comparison anywhere in its recorded history. This is the story of what is happening to Canada's forests, why it is genuinely unprecedented, why the numbers are hard to even fit inside your head, and why it is not stopping. Let me start with 2023. Because that is the year the word record stopped being adequate, and every figure in what follows comes from government agencies and peer-reviewed science. In a normal bad year, Canada might lose a couple of million hectares of forest to fire. The previous all-time records, set in years like 1989, 1995, and 2014, topped out around 7 or 7.5 million hectares, already enormous. In 2023, Canada burned roughly 18 million hectares, not a little past the old record, more than double it. To put a number that large into something you can picture, 18 million hectares is an area larger than the entire state of Florida. It is an area you could not walk across in a month. And it did not burn over decades, it burned in a single fire season, between spring and autumn of 1 year. That figure did not just set a Canadian record, it surpassed the worst fire season in the entire recorded history of North America. Fires burned in all 13 of Canada's provinces and territories at once, the whole country alight simultaneously, from British Columbia to Quebec to the Northwest Territories. Roughly 5% of Canada's entire forest burned in that 1 year. 8 people died. Somewhere between 180,000 and 230,000 people were forced to evacuate their homes, a record. When scientists describe a record falling, they usually mean it was edged out by a few percent. A record that doubles the previous one is not a bad roll of the dice. It is a signal that the system itself has changed. And then the smoke did something that made the whole world pay attention. It did not stay in Canada. In June of 2023, tens of millions of people in the northeastern United States woke up under a sky the color of a bruise. New York City, for a period, had the worst air quality of any major city on the planet. Its skyline vanishing into an orange haze that looked like the surface of Mars. The smoke rolled down into the American Southeast, drifted across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe, and was tracked all the way to China. A fire season in the Canadian Boreal became an air quality event for a significant fraction of the Northern Hemisphere. But the single most astonishing measure of 2023 is not the acreage or the smoke. It is the carbon. When a forest burns, it releases the carbon its trees spent decades or centuries pulling out of the air. And the Canadian fires of 2023 released an amount of carbon that belongs in a category with the world's largest industrial economies. According to a study published in the journal Nature, the 2023 Canadian wildfires emitted roughly 650 million tons of carbon, on the order of 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Let me translate what that means, because it is almost hard to believe. If those wildfires had been a country, their emissions that year would have ranked as the fourth largest on Earth, behind only China, the United States, and India, and ahead of every other nation on the planet. A single fire season out emitted entire industrialized countries. By one analysis, it released roughly 4 times the annual carbon emissions of all global aviation, and around 4 times Canada's own yearly emissions from burning fossil fuels. The fires accounted for more than a quarter of all the tree cover lost anywhere in the world that year. Sit with that for a moment. We spend enormous political effort arguing over fractions of a percent of national emissions, and in 2023, the forests of one country, in a matter of months, put more carbon into the atmosphere than almost any nation's entire economy did in a year. That is what no historical comparison actually means. It is not hyperbole. It is arithmetic. So the obvious question is, why? Why did this happen? And why does it keep happening? The short answer, which the science is now extremely clear about, is climate change, and the mechanism is worth understanding precisely because it is not vague. A dedicated attribution study found that human-caused climate change significantly increased the likelihood of a fire year as extreme as 2023 across most of Canada, more than doubling the odds in the eastern and southwestern parts of the country. The unusually long fire season that year was found to be more than 5 times as likely because of human influence on the climate. And the vast, simultaneous stretches of extreme fire weather across the whole country, the thing that made every province burn at once, were also made far more probable. The year 2023 was, by the measurements, the warmest and driest year Canada had experienced since at least 1980. Here is how that translates into flames. A forest fire needs 3 things: fuel, ignition, and dry conditions to let it spread. Canada is warming at roughly twice the global average rate, and it's far north even faster. Hotter temperatures dry out the forest, the needles, the deadfall, the soil, the peat, more completely and for a longer stretch of the year. That turns the entire landscape into more available fuel, and it extends the window during which that fuel can catch. Warmer, more unstable air also generates more lightning, which is the dominant source of ignition across the remote Boreal, where there are no people to start fires, but millions of acres to burn. So climate change loads all 3 dice at once: more fuel, more ignition, and a longer, drier season in which to burn. The result is not a linear increase. It is the kind of jump that produced 2023. And there is a genuinely unsettling detail in how these new fires behave, one that captures how the rules have changed. They no longer reliably stop in winter. Some of the 2023 fires never actually went out. They burned down into the carbon-rich peat and root systems of the boreal soil and kept smoldering underground, beneath the snow, all through the Canadian winter. And then, as early as February 2024, roughly 150 of them simply reignited and came back to life in the spring. Scientists call them overwintering fires, or, more evocatively, zombie fires. A fire that burns through the snow is not something the old models of Canadian wildfire were built to account for. It is a fire that, in a real sense, no longer ends. That peat is worth understanding, because it is central to why these fires are so hard to stop and so damaging to the climate. Much of the Canadian Boreal sits on top of deep layers of peat, partially decomposed plant matter, thousands of years in the making, that stores immense quantities of carbon in the ground. Some of it is frozen into permafrost, soil that has stayed frozen for centuries or millennia. When fire reaches this material, 2 things happen, both bad. First, the peat can burn, not with visible flames, but as a slow, deep, smoldering combustion that creeps meters underground, is nearly impossible to extinguish with water, and can persist for months. Second, the heat helps thaw the surrounding permafrost, and thawing permafrost releases its own ancient store of carbon. Some of it is methane, a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide over the short term. So a boreal fire does not just burn the trees you can see. It ignites a carbon vault in the ground that has been locked away since before recorded history. And it does so in a way that no fire crew can fully put out. The forest is only the surface of what is actually burning. Now bring it forward, because 2023 was not an isolated spike. It was the opening of a pattern, and that pattern is the real point of this video. It helps, though, to see the run-up, because the warning signs were already flashing before 2023. In 2016, a wildfire that firefighters nicknamed the Beast swept into Fort McMurray, in the heart of Alberta's oil country, and forced the evacuation of about 88,000 people in a single frantic exodus. It became, at the time, the costliest disaster in Canadian history. Then, in the summer of 2021, a small village in British Columbia named Lytton made the news twice in 2 days. First, it set an all-time Canadian heat record that stunned climate scientists, nearly 50 degrees Celsius, a temperature you would expect in Death Valley, not in Canada. And the very next day, a wildfire ignited and destroyed almost the entire village within minutes. So fast that residents barely escaped with their lives. Fort McMurray and Lytton were the tremors before the earthquake, individual towns in specific years, showing what heat and fire could now do. What changed in 2023 was that it stopped being one town or one region and became the entire country at once. The escalation was already underway. 2023 was the moment it went national. The very next year, 2024, was itself one of the 6 worst fire years Canada had seen in half a century, with more than 5 million hectares burned, and it was seeded, in part, by those overwintering zombie fires from 2023 reigniting. That was also the year a wildfire tore into the mountain town of Jasper in the Alberta Rockies and destroyed a large part of it. The year after that, 2025, was another severe, multi-million hectare season, and that brings us to right now. The 2026 season, the one burning as this is made, is the latest chapter, and it is worth being precise and honest about it because it illustrates the pattern perfectly. This year did not start out looking catastrophic. Through the spring and into June, the area burned was actually running below the long-term average. By early July, it was less than half of the 10-year norm, and it looked, if anything, like it might be a mild year. And then, in the space of about 10 days in the middle of July, it erupted. More than 300 new fires ignited. The total area burned tripled, blowing past 2.5, then 3 million hectares, and crossing above the multi-decade average for the date. By mid-July, there were around 1,000 active fires burning simultaneously, stretching from the Atlantic provinces all the way to British Columbia, including new fires breaking out as far east as Nova Scotia. Communities were placed under evacuation orders, including thousands of people around Kimberley, British Columbia, and the smoke, once again, poured south across the border, driving air quality in parts of the American Midwest into hazardous territory, with that record-shattering reading past 600, and reigniting a political argument between the two countries over who is responsible for the smoke. Let me be careful and honest here, because it matters for your trust. As of late July 2026, this season has not surpassed the almost incomprehensible scale of 2023. It may not. What it has done is go from quiet to national emergency in 10 days and become the 4th severe season in an unbroken row. And that, the speed of the ignition and the relentless repetition year after year, is precisely the signature of the new regime. The individual years will vary. Some will be milder, some will be monstrous. What has no historical comparison is the era. 4 severe seasons back to back, a single year that doubled every record ever set, fires that emit more than entire nations, and fires that no longer go out in winter. No previous period in the country's recorded history looks anything like the stretch Canada is living through right now. There is a deeper layer to why this is so alarming, and it has to do with what the Canadian Boreal forest is supposed to do for the entire planet. Under normal conditions, that vast northern forest is one of the world's great carbon sinks. It absorbs enormous quantities of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere every year, quietly doing some of the most important climate work on Earth, accounting for a meaningful share of the entire global land carbon sink. It is supposed to be soaking carbon up. What the 2023 fires demonstrated is that this same forest can, in a single bad year, flip from absorbing carbon to hurling billions of tons of it into the sky, and scientists have openly begun to question whether that sink can be relied upon to continue doing its job as the fires intensify. The tool we are counting on to help slow climate change is being set on fire by climate change. And that points to the grimmest feature of the whole story, the feedback loop. It works like a wheel turning. A warmer, drier climate produces bigger fires. Bigger fires release more carbon into the atmosphere. More carbon in the atmosphere drives more warming. More warming dries the forest further and produces still bigger fires. Each turn of the wheel makes the next turn worse. Global projections suggest that the total area burned worldwide could rise by 30 to 50% by the end of this century, and Canada's Boreal is one of the places where that increase is arriving first and hardest. This is not a spike that returns to baseline once a bad year passes. It is a ratchet, clicking in one direction. The human cost of all this is easy to lose behind the enormous numbers, so it is worth naming plainly. Every one of these seasons means tens of thousands of people forced from their homes, sometimes repeatedly, year after year. It falls with particular weight on remote and indigenous communities across the Boreal, many of them small. Fly and First Nations settlements that have been evacuated over and over as the fires close in, their residents flown to distant cities to wait out a threat to everything they own. It means firefighters, Canadian and, increasingly, international crews flown in from the United States, Australia, South Africa, and beyond, because the fires have grown too large and too numerous for any one nation to handle alone, working brutal, dangerous months, and sometimes dying. And it is worth being honest about the limits of what those firefighters can even do. Because it is not what most people imagine. When there are 1,000 fires burning at once across a country the size of a continent, most of them in remote wilderness, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest road, the idea of putting them out largely dissolves. There are not enough crews, aircraft, or hours in the day to fight them all. So fire managers are forced to triage, in the medical sense of the word. They concentrate their limited resources on protecting towns, critical infrastructure, and lives, and they let the vast backcountry fires burn, monitoring them but making no attempt to stop them, because stopping them is simply not possible. A single one of these megafires can be larger than a small country and generate its own weather, including fire-triggered thunderstorms whose lightning starts still more fires. Against something on that scale, human firefighting is less about extinguishing the fire than about steering its consequences away from people. That is a profound shift from the 20th century idea that a wildfire is something you go out and defeat. And it means the smoke, which has quietly become a public health event for the entire continent. Tens of millions of people across North America now breathing hazardous air for days or weeks each summer, a phenomenon that barely existed a generation ago and is now simply part of the season. It is worth being specific about why the smoke is so dangerous, because it is easy to dismiss as an inconvenience, a hazy sky, a smell in the air. Wildfire smoke is loaded with fine particulate matter, the microscopic particles known as PM2.5, so small that they slip past the body's defenses, lodge deep in the lungs, and pass directly into the bloodstream. Exposure is linked to asthma attacks, heart attacks, strokes, and premature death, and it is especially dangerous for children, the elderly, pregnant women, and anyone with heart or lung conditions. When an air quality index reads past 300, health authorities advise everyone, not just the vulnerable, to stay indoors. Readings past 600, like the one recorded in the American Midwest this summer, are effectively off the standard scale. And because the smoke from these fires travels thousands of kilometers, the health burden is not confined to the people near the flames. A fire in the Northwest Territories can degrade the air and the health of someone in Chicago or Toronto or New York who will never see a single flame. The 2023 season alone exposed well over 100 million people across North America to degraded air. Let me be balanced, because this story deserves honesty rather than pure alarm. Fire is natural and even necessary in the boreal forest. That ecosystem evolved to burn, and some of what burns will regrow. Not every year will be a 2023. There will be milder seasons, and this very year looked mild until the middle of July. Canada has some of the most skilled wildland firefighters in the world, and the country is investing in better prediction, prevention, and response. And smoke, harmful as it is not the same as a town reduced to ash. The end of the world is not scheduled for next summer. But the honest reading of the evidence is unmistakable, and it is not comforting. The scale of what Canada's forests are now doing genuinely has no precedent in the historical record. A single recent season doubled every record ever set and out-emitted almost every country on Earth. The fires now burn across the entire country at once, cross oceans as smoke, and refuse to fully die in winter. 4 severe seasons have arrived in a row, and the science indicates this is not the peak, but a waypoint. The same study that documented 2023's extraordinary heat noted that those record-breaking temperatures are projected to become simply typical for Canadian summers by the 2050s, even under a moderate effort to curb emissions. That is the fact to end on, because it reframes everything. As of this afternoon, in late July of 2026, around 1,000 fires are burning across Canada. The smoke is drifting over American cities, and the most dangerous weeks of the season still lie ahead. 3 years ago, the country set a record so far beyond the previous ones that record hardly describes it, and every single year since, the fires have come roaring back. Canada's forests have burned for 10,000 years. But not like this. Not this often. Not this large. Not all at once. Not releasing the carbon of nations. Not smoldering through the snow to rise again in spring. The scale has no historical comparison. And the hardest truth in the entire story is that, on the trajectory we are actually on, the seasons we are living through right now, these, the ones that feel unprecedented, may one day be remembered as the mild ones.